It can start with a knock on the door one morning. It is the local Indian agent, or the parish priest, or perhaps a mounted police officer. The bus for residential school leaves that morning. It is a day the parents have long been dreading. Even if the children have been warned in advance, the morning's events are still a shock. The officials have arrived, and the children must go. For tens of thousands of Aboriginal children for over a century, this was the beginning of their residential schooling. They were torn from their parents, who often surrendered them only under threat of prosecution. Then, they were hurled into a strange and frightening place, one in which their parents and culture would be demeaned and oppressed. In 2011, 2 years into its mandate, the TRC published this interim report entitled, "They Came for the Children," which illustrates the painful reality of residential schools and their impact on Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit families across Canada. The question here is, what role did the residential schools play in the process of colonization?
It took my parents many, many years to help us. There were 6 of us apprehended from our parents. My parents were severely traumatized from that, and then they had to grieve for losing 6 children overnight. We had to grieve for our parents because we didn't know why we were taken away.
In 1879, Nicholas Davin, a failed Conservative candidate and Minister of the Interior in Sir John A. Macdonald's government, carried out a brief study of the boarding schools that the United States government had established for Native Americans. He recommended that Canada establish a series of such schools on the prairies. Davin acknowledged that a central element of the education provided at these schools would be directed towards the destruction of Aboriginal spirituality. Since all civilizations were based on religion, it would be inexcusable, he thought, to do away with Aboriginal faith without supplying a better one. For this reason, he recommended that while the government should fund the schools, the churches should operate them. Roman Catholic, Anglican, United, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches were the major denominations involved in the administration of the residential school system. The government's partnership with the churches remained in place until 1969, and, although most of the schools had closed by the 1980s, the last federally supported residential schools remained in operation until the late 1990s.
The federal government was determined to eradicate any sense of Indianness in the country. We were a nuisance, we were bother, we had, we were unsettled, we were highly mobile, right? We covered a lot of territory, and they wanted this to become more sedentary, more settled. And so when they were figuring out who would implement this policy, the obvious choice were the churches, because they had a network that extended to just about every Indigenous community and nation/tribe in the entire country.
To put it quite succinctly, the residential school system was a creation of the government, and the churches were the agents of that system. The churches were the ones that basically staffed the schools, the churches and the religious orders, right? And so I think there's no question that we took children away from their families, took them away from their homes. We stripped them of their identity as Indigenous people. I mean, the policy of the day was kill the Indian in that child and turn him into a civilized adult. So, and the church just arbitrarily baptized every indigenous child. Arbitrarily did it. And crushed any opportunity for the children to either express or learn anything of their own traditional spirituality. And it was basically described as evil.
In justifying the investment in industrial schools to Parliament in 1883, Public Works Minister Hector Langevin argued that, "If you wish to educate these children, you may separate them from their parents during the time that they are being educated. If you leave them in the family, they may know how to read and write, but they still remain savages, whereas by separating them in the way proposed, they acquire the habits and tastes, it is to be hoped only the good tastes, of civilized people."
Everything is based on our land, our heritage, our culture, our traditions, and our heritage is all land-based. And when they put us on reserves and Indian residential schools, the purpose was for land. And when they established the Indian residential schools, they entered into a joint venture with the church. And in any joint venture, each of the parties expects to benefit. And the government expected to benefit from our land, and the church expected to benefit from our souls.
The government believed that between the forced labor of students and the poorly paid labor of missionaries, it could operate a residential school system on a nearly cost-free basis. The missionaries and the students were indeed a source of cheap labor, but the government was never happy with the quality of the teaching, and no matter how hard students worked, their labor never made the schools self-supporting. Status Indian and Métis children attended early church-run residential schools together, and the federal government had policies that allowed admission of Métis children to their schools as well. However, since education in Canada is a provincial jurisdiction, the federal government began instructing Indian agents to remove Métis children from the schools. Despite constitutional responsibility, the provinces and territories did not provide educational services to Métis children. Métis parents then were forced to enroll their children in residential schools, both church-run and federally funded. In the mid-1950s, large numbers of Inuit children began attending residential schools in the north, which were separated from home sometimes by vast distances of hundreds of miles. Because the history of these schools is so recent, not only are there many living survivors today, but there are many living parents of survivors. For these reasons, both the intergenerational impacts and the legacy of the schools are particularly strong in the north.
When they took me away, my parents did not understand one bit of English. So who I left behind are still there. They're still back home. They have no education of whatsoever in the English form, but they know everything in the Inuit form. Therefore, I'm caught in between the two dynamic worlds of Inuit and English. Very well educated people will not look into me because I am not educated enough. The dynamic culture of the Inuit will not look into me because I have to mix my language in Inuit and English. Therefore, I am nothing to both worlds.
The closing of the residential schools, starting in the 1960s, was accompanied by the commencement of what has come to be known as the 60s Scoop, the wide-scale apprehension of Aboriginal children by child welfare authorities. child welfare agencies across Canada removed thousands of Aboriginal children from their families and communities and placed them in non-Aboriginal homes with little consideration of the need to preserve their culture and identity. Children were placed in homes in different parts of the country, in the United States, and even overseas. This practice actually extended well beyond the 1960s, until at least the mid to late 1980s. By 1980, 4.6% of all First Nations children were in care.
I compare our child welfare system to the residential school that we grew up in. The similarities are there, and I ask the government, open your eyes. What's so different that we're taking children away now?
I cannot thank the school for my education today, because when I left, I could hardly read. I could hardly speak English. But when I left, I made it a point to learn the dictionary. And today, I'm a bookworm. Thank you. I cannot go to bed without a book beside me. I learned to read.
The model for these residential schools for Aboriginal children, both in Canada and the United States, did not come from the private boarding schools to which members of the economic elites in Britain and Canada sent their children. Instead, the model came from the reformatories and industrial schools that were being constructed in Europe and North America for the children of the urban poor. And the educational goals of residential schools were set very low in the sense that Indigenous children were being prepared not for professions, but for menial roles of servitude in Canadian society, roles like farmhands, maids, and kitchen help.
So at residential schools, for example, the education students were being given was often education for menial labor jobs. These were not, we were not training Indigenous students at residential schools to go on to be doctors and lawyers. We were much more, the system was looking to train them to become domestics, maids, servants, farm workers, and so forth.
Many principals and teachers had low expectations of their students. Wigwemikong, Ontario Principal R. Baudin wrote in 1883, "What we may reasonably expect from the generality of children is certainly not to make great scholars of them. Good and moral as they may be, they lack great mental capacity."
He had to go to university at least 3, 4, 5 years to get his ministry. And yet, he was so educated, and us young people that were there, he called us, we were heathens, and we were savages. But I was young that time. I didn't understand those words. They didn't really mean anything to me. But as time went by, when I got older and older, I began to realize those words really meant something very, very bad to us people.
At High River, Alberta, in the 1880s, students who were not learning a trade were expected to put in 2 hours a day of chores in the winter and 4 hours in the summer. According to Principal E. Claude, to these youngest ones pertained the weeding of the garden and the housework on their side of the school, and I must say that this summer none denied our watchword, no idleness here, as all work was exclusively done by the pupils. The government's hostile approach to Aboriginal languages was reiterated in numerous policy directives. In 1883, Indian Commissioner Edgar Dewdney instructed Battleford School Principal Thomas Clark that great attention was to be given towards imparting a knowledge of the art of reading, writing, and speaking the English language rather than that of Cree.
We went to the Blood Reserve Indian Residential School, St. Paul's. The only thing I remember bad about it was the one kid wouldn't give up on his culture. He'd get 10 straps on each hand every Monday morning. And even my brother and I were getting straps, us little Cree boys. So we would be learning the Blackfoot language, and we'd get straps on the hands.
The buildings were not only fire traps, they were also incubators of disease. Rather than helping combat the tuberculosis crisis in the broader Aboriginal community, the poor condition of the schools served to intensify it. The 1906 annual report of Dr. Peter Bryce, the Chief Medical Officer for Indian Affairs, observed that the Indian population of Canada has a mortality rate of more than double that of the whole population, and in some provinces more than 3 times. Tuberculosis was the prevalent cause of death. Dr. Bryce recommended in 1909 that Canada's residential schools be turned into sanatoria and placed under his administration. This plan was rejected because it was viewed as being too costly, and it was thought that it would have met with church opposition. The death rates for Aboriginal children in the residential schools were far higher than those experienced by members of the general Canadian population. Graph 4 shown here compares the death rate per 1,000 of the general population of Canadian children aged 5 to 14 with the death rates per 1,000 of the named register and the named and unnamed registers combined. The death rates are provided as 5-year averages. As can be seen highlighted in yellow, until the 1950s, Aboriginal children in residential schools died at a far higher rate than school-aged children in the general population. It is only in the 1950s that the residential school death rates declined to a level comparable to that of the general school-aged population. As late as the 1941-45 period, the named and unnamed combined residential school death rate was 4.9 times higher than the general death rate. It is estimated that approximately 6,000 children died in the residential schools, but there is no way to say with certainty because in 1920, the government stopped recording the deaths.
I never heard my dad cry, never seen him show emotion, so that's the way that I carried myself through life. But when I was in residential school, being really lonesome for home, being lonesome for my family, what I used to do was bury my head in the pillow middle of the night. And I thought that I was the only one doing that until one night I heard a couple of other boys in the dorm crying as well. So I know that there's a lot of us that must have missed our families, our homes. So the grief that I carry is about all of that. And I'm tired of carrying that. I want to let it go as well.
This is the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. Some schools like this one had a specific room set aside to serve as a punishment room. After a 1907 inspection of the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, the Ontario Inspector for Indian Agencies, J.G. Ramsden, reported, "I cannot say that I was favorably impressed with the sight of the 2 prison cells in the boys' playhouse. I was informed, however, that these were for pupils who ran away from the institution, confinement being for a week at a time when pupils returned." The full extent of the abuse that occurred in the schools is only now coming to light. As of January 31, 2015, the independent assessment process, established under the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, had received 37,951 claims for injuries resulting from physical and sexual abuse at residential schools. The number of claims for compensation for abuse is equivalent to approximately 48% of the number of former students who were eligible to make such claims. This number does not include those former students who died prior to May 2005. Appendix 3 of the TRC report contains the names of about 40 individuals who have been convicted in Canadian courts of sexually abusing students at residential schools. The list was compiled by the TRC through a review of the documents provided by parties to the settlement agreement, government archives, court records, and searches of databases. On the rinks, the athletic fields and parade grounds, or in the arts and handicraft rooms and on performance stages, many students found a way to express themselves, and through that, gained the opportunity to explore their own talents and sometimes other parts of the country or the world. Some northern schools developed reputations for academic success. Grandin College in Fort Smith was established by the Oblates to recruit young people for the Catholic ministry. A new principal, Father Jean Pochat, decided to focus on providing young men and women with leadership training. The school became known as a leadership factory, producing numerous future government leaders for the North.
In our residential school, that began operation in 1907, I believe, the students there worked half day. The farm that was used to sustain not just our school, but other Catholic centers like in St. Boniface. And half day was for writing, arithmetic, and religious studies. And by the time I entered school in 1951, my first year, it was full day of classes. My siblings that preceded me at the residential school was full day classes. So that approach had changed, and there was a greater commitment to education.
Former staff and the children of former staff members have expressed the view that much of the discussion of the history of residential schools has overlooked both the positive intent with which many staff members approached their work and the positive accomplishments of the school system. Although they certainly believed the system was underfunded, they also believed that they and their parents devoted much of their lives to educating and caring for Aboriginal children. They spent their time teaching, cooking, cleaning, farming, and supervising children. On their own, these can be seen as positive, not negative activities. For the most part, the school staff members were not responsible for the policies that separated children from their parents and lodged them in inadequate and underfunded facilities. In fact, many staff members spent much of their time and energy attempting to humanize a harsh and often destructive system. Along with the children's own resilience, such staff members share credit for any positive results of the schools.
I taught my children to be kind, to be caring, and to be forgiving. I didn't want to carry the anger from residential school. But that's my choice, not to carry that anger. I choose to forgive, no matter what your color is. But I also ask other people outside our communities to understand that there's still a lot of hurt in our communities, there's still a lot of frustration, and there's still a lot of people walking around with their demons. Not to be judgmental, but to be supportive. Because we have our own wars going internally in our own communities with those demons. With all the suicides, the addictions, the abuse that still people are still carrying today. And we continue the fight.